and welcome to Callus Prep. Today we're going to be talking about inference questions. Alright, so an inference question is similar to a summary question, except that the inference it's an inference, so you kind of read between the lines and you make a logical assumption based on what the author said. But it's not something that's directly stated in the passage like the summary question. So we're looking for support, but not necessarily summary. All right, so let's take a look at this first passage here. And I'd like you to pause the video, read through the passage, and then when you're ready, start it back up and we'll talk about the question and how to approach inference questions in general on the SAT. All right, so like I mentioned, inference questions are, they're similar to summary questions. They're asking us what the author suggested, so that's already looking very similar to a summary question. However, it's not a paraphrase of what the author said in this case. It's an inference, so it's kind of like a logical guess based on what the author said. We have to make a logical conclusion based on the information presented. But again, these are not direct summaries of the author's statements. So in this case, we're not looking for a paraphrase, but we're looking for support for each of the answer choices. When we go through it, we're going to see if we can support it based on the information presented in the passage. So in answer choice A, the answer choice is telling us that the Union Army lacked the discipline for a rapid chase. So is there enough support, or is there enough evidence to support that answer choice? Well, if you notice at the end of the passage here, the author does indicate that the Union Army was following the Confederate Army. They were pursuing them, but he also says that they were pursuing them at a respectful distance, which does kind of imply that they were not rapidly chasing them down. However, it doesn't necessarily imply that the reason they were not engaging in a rapid chase was a lack of discipline. It never actually indicates the reason at all. So we can't just assume that the army was lacking in discipline. So A doesn't have quite enough support to be the correct answer. So we will eliminate it and take a look at B, which tells us that the members of the Union Army were expecting the Confederate Army to perform a sortie. And this is kind of typical of an SAT answer choice. They'll throw in a word that you don't know, and then it really makes it hard to answer the question. In this case, I don't actually expect anybody to know this word. I don't expect you to even see it on the SAT, but just for the sake of clarification, sortie is a military technique. And it's basically the technique described in the first few lines of the passage there. Basically, when an army is sort of on the defensive and being pursued the way the Confederate Army was in this case, and then suddenly they, break into enemy territory and engage in their own offensive, that is a sortie. But that's just for your own information. And you could even use the context of the answer choice and the passage, the information that we're given, to fill that gap in. Obviously, they don't expect you to know what that means, but they do expect you to be able to use context to determine that that they're just simplifying what was already presented by using a difficult word. So now that we know what it is, let's assess this answer choice. So are the members of the Union Army expecting the Confederates to perform a sortie? Are the Union Army, are the members of the Union Army expecting the Confederates to turn around and attack them? And the answer is probably not. In that opening few lines, like I mentioned, where he describes what the sortie is, he also seems to be kind of shocked that the Confederate Army could do such a thing. He says that Lee's moves were bold. So it kind of implies that the Union Army actually was not expecting that to happen. So B can also be eliminated. And let's take a look at C, which tells us that the Union Army had been avoiding a direct confrontation with the Confederate Army. And in this case, we might be able to use this answer choice. As I mentioned earlier, the Union Army was following at a respectful distance. And the way the author describes that, it sort of implies that the Union Army was giving the Confederate Army space. And almost like intentionally giving them space. And if you're intentionally, following at a respectful distance, intentionally giving the other army some space, it sort of logically follows that you're avoiding a direct confrontation because you're giving them that extra space even though you don't have to. So logically, maybe they could be avoiding a direct confrontation, just based on the fact that they are intentionally giving up space. But of course, we do want to take a look at answer choice D just to make sure that it's not better than C, because even though we do have support for C, maybe D is a more clear choice. So we're going to take a look at that, which tells us that the Union Army was much smaller than the Confederate Army. And the author does tell us the size of the Confederate Army. He tells us that Lee is at the head of 70,000 men. So we know that the Confederate Army has 70,000 troops. But he never indicates the size of the Union Army. So we really can't make a comparison since we only know the size of the Confederate Army but not the size of the Union Army. So actually D is not a better choice, and we are going to stick with C. I do like it, and I am going to solidify that on my answer sheet. All right, let's take a look at the next passage here. And I'd like you to pause the video, take a minute to read through the passage, and then when you're ready, of course, start it back up and we'll talk about this question and, of course, how we can approach inference questions in general. All right, again, we're being asked, what an implication of the author's statements is. And again, we're just going to look for support for the answer choices, but the answer will not directly be stated in the passage. So we're just looking for evidence, but not a summary. So with that in mind, let's take a look at those four answer choices. And A tells us that all planets orbiting a star in its habitable zone contain water. Well, let's take a look at the part of the passage where the author describes a habitable zone, just so we're clear on the relationship here before we assess the validity of this answer choice. And the author actually gives us a definition of a habitable zone, and she tells us that it's the area around a star where liquid water could pool on the surface of an orbiting planet. So, what that tells us is that if a star or if a planet is in a star's habitable zone, it may contain liquid water. Well, answer choice A tells us that all planets do contain water in a habitable zone, which is too much of a generalization. And of course, you always want to be careful when you approach general statements in an answer choice on the SAT reading test. Anytime there's a generalization like this, it's very hard to prove it right. It's very easy to kind of disprove it with one counterexample. So do be careful when you approach generalizations. They aren't always incorrect, but typically general blanket statements like that are very easy to disprove. So, and we did disprove it here. So be careful with those. All right. Choice B tells us that planets in a star's habitable zone often host life. And well, the name habitable zone does imply that there could be life, but there's nothing in the passage itself that talks about other planets other than Earth, hosting life in or outside of a star's habitable zone. There's no mention of how many stars in habitable zones contain life forms or anything like that. There's really just not enough evidence to support answer choice B, so we can eliminate that as well. And C tells us that the sun is the only star known to have a reliable habitable zone. And so here, I want to highlight this word reliable here. That's kind of a strange word to include when we're discussing habitable zones. What does it mean for a reliable zone to be or for a habitable zone to be reliable? We're really unclear about that. So I want to be careful with this answer choice in general, just because of that word. It's just kind of, it sounds strange. It doesn't add any information. It kind of adds some new information that is not ever mentioned by the author. The author never mentions anything about habitable zones being reliable or not. So we're going to be careful with that. And also, we know that it's actually untrue because the whole point of this passage is to discuss a star, planet found in a star's habitable zone. Well, if we found a planet in a different star's habitable zone, we already know that another star has a habitable zone. So, and again, the reliable or unreliable, we really have no information about that. So we're going to eliminate choice C, which leaves us with D. Earth orbits in the sun's habitable zone. And here we're hoping we have some information to support this. We're given that, again, the habitable zone is the area where liquid water can form on the surface of a planet. So based on that information alone, we can deduce that Earth must orbit in the sun's habitable zone because there's liquid water on Earth's surface. And this is an example of where you're allowed to bring outside knowledge into the test, into the reading test, but normally you don't want to do that. Obviously, the knowledge that Earth contains liquid water on its surface, it's a very common fact. It's not something that's ever up for debate, really. So since it's a very concrete fact, and it's a very it's something that everybody knows. It's a very widespread knowledge. It's not something specialized. So we're allowed to use our knowledge of Earth and the water on its surface to make the logical conclusion that, yes, there's liquid water on the surface, therefore Earth must orbit in the sun's habitable zone. All right, let's take a look at the final passage here. And I'd like you to pause the video one more time, read through this last passage, and then when you're ready, start it back up and we can talk about that question and how to approach inference questions on the SAT. All right, so again, we're going to take a look at each of these answer choices and decide which one has the most support. So we're making an inference about skyscrapers. And the first choice tells us that renting an office in a skyscraper is expensive. And if you notice, the author, or the narrator rather, mentions the cost of renting an office in a skyscraper. He tells us that it's over $36,000 a year. And well, if you notice, the passage was written in 1912. But I don't want you to go jumping to any conclusions that $36,000 a year in 1912 was expensive. Yeah, even if you did the math and you figured out what that was in today's dollars, the idea of the cost of rent being expensive is very subjective. What's expensive to you and what's expensive to me might be very different things. So we have to be very careful. And in this case, I'm more concerned about the author's attitude towards the cost of rent rather than the exact dollar amount. And in this case, the author treats it actually as if it were expensive. He says, over $36,000 a year with an exclamation mark. He's kind of like, wow, like overwhelmed at how expensive it is. And in that case, I do think A is actually a good answer. So I will hang on to it. And of course, I do like to analyze each of my incorrect answer choices before I solidify A as the correct one, just to make sure that there's not a better answer out there. So B tells us that European cities did not contain skyscrapers when the passage was published. And if you notice, the author tells us that the office he's visiting is nothing like a European business office. But he doesn't necessarily mention anything about it, about the skyscraper itself. There's just not enough evidence for us to know whether or not there are skyscrapers in European cities. Just because this is his first time in a skyscraper and he happens to be in the United States, that doesn't give us enough information. It's partially supported, but really we don't quite have enough evidence to be very happy about B. And it's certainly not better than A, so we can easily eliminate it. When we already have a good answer choice, we're not going to throw that out for a worse answer choice. So I'm eliminating B. And let's take a look at C. Skyscrapers were invented in New York. Well, the author does mention New York. He happens to be in New York. It's the first skyscraper he visits, but no indication that skyscrapers themselves were invented in New York. Really, no support there. That's a pretty easy elimination. Finally, D tells us that skyscrapers share many architectural features with sailboats. And the author does compare the experience of being in a skyscraper to that of being on a sailboat. but he's more comparing the experience rather than the architecture. He's not saying that skyscrapers and sailboats share architectural design features, and that's really a pretty easy assumption to eliminate. Again, he's comparing an experience, not design elements. So we're left with A, which again we already liked as our answer choice, but now that we've eliminated each of the other ones, we're pretty happy selecting that as the correct choice. And I just want you to keep in mind when you approach inference questions on the reading test, we're looking for support. Sometimes the answer choice won't always be the best, but as long as it's supportable by information in the passage, it's usually going to be the right choice, as long as there's a little bit of support and you can logically use that evidence to come to the conclusion made in the answer choice. You should be feeling pretty good about that answer. And of course, always use process of elimination, because it's very easy to find fault with incorrect answer choices, and it's very easy to prove that they do not have support from the passage. So always, always, always make sure you analyze each of the answer choices and determine which ones do and do not have support. All right, that about does it for today's lecture, and we'll see you next time.